Perfect. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar about the E-2 visa, and thank you for your patience. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am a senior associate at Scott Legal PC in New York City. Today we're going to be talking about what is probably the most popular visa that we help our clients navigate, and that is the E-2 Treaty Investor Visa. There's actually very good reason for this visa being so popular, namely that it is one of the more streamlined visa options. It's relatively fast. It has a not too burdensome documentation requirement. And once you're approved, you basically have multiple entries and exits into the U.S. to develop and direct a business. In fact, our firm was started on an E-2 visa by our founder, Ian Scott, over a decade ago. He continues to maintain E-2 status, and the fact that he has navigated the process personally really does influence the way that we work with our clients. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Our firm is focused on business visas, though we do handle all aspects of U.S. immigration law. So we have a very active and successful family-based immigration practice, as well as a practice focused on temporary visas, whether that's student visas, visitor visas. We also have a litigation unit should we need to sue on behalf of a client, either to get a case unstuck, to challenge a denial, or any other aspect of U.S. immigration. So really the takeaway is if you are dealing with any aspect of U.S. immigration law, we would be very happy to speak with you over a consultation. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a week. If you would like, we do hope that you'll sign up for future webinars. After this presentation, we'll send you an email where you can sign up for our future webinars. You'll also be getting the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen now. We will also share with you a comprehensive guide on the E-2 visa, as well as a link where you can schedule a consultation. So during our webinars, we usually don't get into case-specific information. We do welcome you to reach out to us for a consultation if you would like to talk about the specifics of your circumstances. On that note, if you do have a question, please send it in through either the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom. I do plan to get through all of the questions by the end of the presentation. I'll probably save questions for the end, but don't hesitate to send them in at any time. All right, without further ado, I will go ahead and dive in by talking about the E-2 visa requirements. So the E-2 visa is a wonderful option for someone who wants to come to the U.S. to develop and direct a business. And the E-2 investor visa is for someone who owns at least half of that business. So it is for a business owner. We'll talk about how the owner can either start the business as a startup, purchase an existing business, or start a franchise. Those are really the 3 typical pathways to an E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is a treaty visa. What do we mean by that? That means that in order to get an E-2 visa, you need to have a passport from an E-2 treaty country. Now, the list of E-2 treaty countries is easy to find if you just Google E-2 treaty countries. You'll find a list. It's published by the U.S. Department of State. Right now, I believe there are over 80 E-2 treaty countries, and they are in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, really all over the world there are E-2 treaty countries. So do check the list to see if your country of nationality is on it. Now you only need a passport from an E-2 treaty country. You don't need to have been born there. You don't even need to have necessarily ever lived in an E-2 treaty country. An example I like to use is, let's say you were born in Uruguay, which is not an E-2 treaty country, but your parents are from Italy. So you have Italian citizenship through your parents and you hold an Italian passport. Even if you've never been to Italy, the fact that you have an Italian passport qualifies you on this nationality piece. So you just need a passport from an E-2 treaty country. Now, a few countries that are not E-2 treaty countries are Brazil, China, and India. Obviously very populous countries. There are many others, South Africa, etc., that are not E-2 treaty countries. So If you have a passport from a country that is not an E2 treaty country and you don't have an E2 treaty passport, your option is to acquire citizenship in an E2 treaty country, and typically that's done through investment. So Grenada is a popular option where you can oftentimes receive citizenship in Grenada, which is an E2 treaty country, in a year or so. Now, the thing to be aware of is that there is now a requirement that you need to have lived in the E2 treaty country. If you acquired citizenship through investment, you need to live in that country for at least 3 years, which is obviously a hurdle for many people. But it is still an option. So if you have a passport, say, from India, and no E2 treaty country passport, you can acquire citizenship, say, in Grenada or another E2 treaty country through investment, live in that country for 3 years, and you'd be eligible for an E2 visa. You do need to own at least 50% of the E2 treaty country, E2 company. So that means that it's possible to have 2 E2 treaty investors through a single company. If each one owns 50% of the company, you can have 2 E2 treaty investors. Alternatively, as long as you own 50%, it doesn't really matter who owns the rest of the company. So you could be 50% owner and the rest of the company is owned by a U.S. citizen, or the rest of the company is owned by 100 people around the world. What matters is if you are the person applying for the E2 investor visa, you need to have at least 50% ownership in the E2 company. And that needs to be maintained. So even after you get the visa, you need to make sure that your ownership does not drop below 50%. You need to be coming to the United States to develop and direct that company. So when you get an E2 visa and you enter the U.S. in E2 status, you receive automatic work authorization, but it is to work at the E2 treaty company. What that means is you cannot, for example, work for the E2 company and work for Uber on the side. You cannot work part-time for Starbucks while you're running your company. Your work authorization is limited to your E2 company. And that is very important to know, because if you violate your work authorization, you could violate your status, of course, which could compromise your visa, could compromise your status, etc., and your opportunity to renew the visa and extend your status in the future. So it's important to comply with that. The next requirement you see on your screen is you need to make a substantial investment into the E2 company. So in terms of the timeline, what usually happens is, first of all, someone will have the passport, E2 treaty country passport. They will then start a company in the U.S. That's done through a specific state. Let's say you want to start a company in Texas. You would usually set up a limited liability company or a corporation in Texas. Once that's done, you'll apply for an employer identification number through the Internal Revenue Service, the tax authority in the United States. Once you have that employer identification number, or the EIN as it's called, you can open a business bank account for your LLC. That process can take as short as a couple weeks to a month or two, but it's usually quite fast. Just open your business bank account, and you would transfer your personal funds into that business bank account. And then you would spend those funds on the business, on everything that's needed for the business to be operational. So that transfer of funds to the E2 company and the spending of those funds is meeting this substantial investment requirement. So the funds must be at risk. What that means is it's not enough to just transfer your personal funds into the business bank account. You actually need to spend them, because of course, if you run the company, you transfer funds to the business bank account, you can always transfer the funds out. The government knows that. So the government wants to see that you've actually spent the funds. How much investment is enough? We'll talk more about this on the next slide, but in the general rule is that you need to spend enough to make the business operational. And it's good to shoot for at least $100,000, but frankly, we have many clients who invest less than $100,000, and we'll talk about navigating that in the next slide. Finally, you need to clearly show exactly where those personal funds came from. So the funds do need to be your personal funds that you're transferring to the E2 company, but You could have received those funds through work, through selling property, such as an apartment, from an inheritance, a gift from a family member or a friend. You just need to document exactly where the funds came from, all the way to their source. So if the funds were a gift from a generous parent, let's say, then your parent would need to provide documents that would be included in your application showing exactly where they got the funds from. Maybe they sold an apartment, or maybe they have been working for a number of years and saving these funds. But you do need to document exactly where you got the funds from. The next requirement is that the business must be real and operating. What that means is that a couple things. The first is that when you're at your visa interview at the consulate, you need to be ready to explain that all you need is a visa in order for the business to be operational. That the only thing this business is waiting for is for you to enter the United States and start running the company. You have an office space, you have all the inventory you need, you have all the equipment you need, you've started marketing, you have a website. All of the steps have been taken so that once you arrive in the United States with your E-2 visa, that business is ready to operate. Now that requirement also helps to explain what you should spend the money on to meet the substantial investment requirement. So if you need an office space, you need to have signed a lease and started paying for the lease. If you need equipment, you need to show you've paid for that equipment. If you need inventory, you need to show you've paid for that inventory. And once you've done all those things, that's your investment schedule. And that's what you're going to include in the application to show that you've made a substantial investment in the company. The other aspect of real and operating is there are certain types of businesses, and we'll talk about these later, that the government does not think are real and operating. So as an example, a company that does real estate investment. So if you start a company and what it does is it buys property, it holds that property, and then it waits for the property to appreciate, and it sells the property. The government doesn't typically think that a company like that is actually real and operating. It's more speculative. It's also not necessarily requiring the activity of employees, and that is a huge requirement. You do need to convince the government that the business needs employees. So we'll talk more about that and certain types of companies that the government thinks, or the starting point is that the government assumes they are not real and operating for E-2 purposes. So I mentioned hiring U.S. workers. That's the next bullet you see on your screen. I would say that this is probably the most important requirement. I like to say that it is a make or break requirement. What I mean by that is if you convince the government that your business will hire U.S. workers, then other requirements become less important. And one specific example is the investment requirement. If you can show you already have 5 full-time U.S. employees on payroll, it's less important that you've spent, say, $100,000 on the business. Let's say you've spent $50,000 on the business. If the consular officer comes back and says, well, but you've only paid $50,000 for this business, you've only invested $50,000, what your response would be is, that's correct, but clearly we've invested enough for the business to be operational because we are already employing 5 U.S. workers. And that is usually sufficient to meet the requirement because, again, substantial investment, it's not a defined dollar amount. What it is a sufficient investment to make the business operational and to show your commitment to the business. So if you already have an operational business, it's already employing U.S. workers, creating jobs for U.S. workers, there's a good argument you have that you've met the investment requirement. On the other hand, if you don't convince the government that you will hire U.S. workers, there's a very good chance you'll be denied. Even if you've spent $10 million on your business, the government wants to see that this is a business that's going to create jobs for U.S. workers. So this employment requirement really is a key requirement. So how many U.S. employees? We usually say to aim for at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. workers within a 5-year period. So let's say you have a startup, you're applying for your visa. You need to show the government that within the next 5 years, you will have at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. employees. And when it comes time to renew your E-2 visa, you do want to show you have at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. employees. That's going to make for a much stronger renewal application. Finally, you need to show to the government your intent to return to your home country once your E-2 status ends. The reason for this is the E-2 visa is not a green card. It's not a permanent resident card. It is a temporary visa. Now, you can renew the E-2 visa indefinitely. As long as you remain eligible, you can continue to renew it. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, our firm was started on an E-2 visa, and Ian, our founder, continues to renew that visa. The firm was started over 10 years ago. So he has renewed the visa a few times. You can continue to renew the visa, even though it's temporary, as long as you meet the requirements and can show the government your intent is not to permanently reside in the U.S. Your intent is to temporarily be in the U.S. to run this business and to continue to create jobs for U.S. workers. Now, fortunately, this is usually an easy requirement to meet. And you would show the government your intent by simply signing a declaration that's included in your application. So let's talk about a few options and timing for an E-2 visa. So the two most common ways to pursue an E-2 visa are first to start a business in the U.S. And that's what I was describing before, where you start a limited liability company or a corporation in a state in the United States, apply for your employer identification number or EIN through the IRS, start a business bank account, put money into it, spend the funds that are necessary to make the business operational. That's starting a business. The other option, which is actually usually a great option to pursue an E-2, is to purchase an existing business in the United States. So if you work with, say, a business broker who sells small businesses, you might find a business that already employs 3 U.S. workers, and you might buy that business. And that could be a wonderful E-2 application. A couple points on that. If you're going to buy a business, do make sure that it already meets the E-2 requirements. So for example, if you're looking to buy a business, I would say don't buy a business that has 1 employee, because you're going to have to explain that when you apply for the E-2 visa. The government is going to ask, this business has had 1 employee, why hasn't it employed more people, and what are you going to do to increase the employment figures at this company? Rather than having to start from that defensive position, put yourself in a position of strength by instead looking at businesses that already have 3 full-time equivalent employees, so that you can show up at your interview and say, we are already satisfying these requirements. It's not that you, officer, have to assume that we will in the future. We're already doing it. And here are the payroll records showing that that the company already employs those employees. The second thing to know about buying a business in the U.S. is that you have a tool called escrow, which can be extremely helpful for someone buying a business. And what escrow allows you to do, it allows you to protect your investment. This is actually the only exception that exists to actually putting your funds at risk. I said before, to meet the substantial investment requirement, you need to put your personal funds at risk. Usually that means actually spending the money. So if you have a startup, you're going to be paying for that office lease, buying equipment, buying inventory. You're going to be sending out your money to all these different places. Very hard to get that money back, if not impossible. However, if you're buying a business, you can enter into an escrow agreement, which basically is between you and the seller of the business. And you say, okay, you're selling your business for $100,000. I'm going to put my funds into an escrow account that's overseen by an escrow agent. And the only condition is approval of the visa. So if my visa is approved, those funds immediately go to the seller. But if my visa is denied, those funds immediately come back to me. So your funds, there's an option for you to get your funds back if the visa is denied. So it's a wonderful option for you to get your funds back if the visa is denied. And again, this is the only exception to actually spending the funds before you apply for the visa. Now, obviously, escrow only makes sense if you're buying something big. You're not going to be able to do escrow for, say, your office lease or to buying equipment or office chairs or laptop computers at Apple. You can't really use an escrow agreement for that because it's a small amount and Apple's not going to enter into an escrow agreement with you. But if it's a big purchase and it's between you and the seller of the business, escrow is much more feasible. Importantly, the only condition that's allowed on an escrow agreement is approval of the visa. So you cannot enter into an escrow agreement and say, the funds will be released once the visa is approved and I have a chance to look at the business in person because I'll have my visa. I'll go look at it. That's not going to be approved. You actually need to say the only thing that has to happen is approval of the visa, and then my funds are released. So next, how long is the E2 visa valid for? So the time frame is from 3 months to 5 years. And again, this is the visa. So what a visa allows you to do is to seek entry into the U.S. So once you have an E2 visa, then you can approach the border and say, border officer, please let me in. Here's my visa. You can seek entry on the last day that your visa is valid. So let's say you get a 5-year E2 visa. You can seek entry on the last day, as long as your visa is valid, on the last day of validity. When you enter, you're typically given 2 years of E2 status. And E2 status is how long you're allowed to stay in the U.S. So E2 status has nothing to do with visa validity. The visa is only to enter the U.S. And then once you're in the U.S., what matters is your I-94 form, which is available online. You should check it every time you enter the U.S. You need to leave the U.S. before your I-94 expires. But for purposes of this discussion, I said that the E2 visa is valid for between 3 months and 5 years. That usually comes down to your country of nationality, meaning the country that issued the passport that you have. So certain countries like the United Kingdom, Canada will issue 5-year visas. Other countries will issue visas for shorter periods of time. It could be 2 years, it could be as low as 3 months. The way you figure out how long your validity period is for your country of nationality is to Google U.S. Department of State reciprocity. Reciprocity is basically an agreement the United States has with the country that issued your passport, and that defines the period that your visa can be valid for. The other factor that determines how long your visa can be valid for is the consular officer. So even if the reciprocity period is, say, 5 years, so you can be issued an E2 visa for up to 5 years, the consular officer can still choose to limit that period, to issue it for a shorter period of time. So for example, if you are applying in Toronto, you have a Canadian passport, you're eligible for a visa of up to 5 years. But if you tell the officer this is a startup and it's a risky startup, it's speculative, the officer might say, well, in that case, I'm going to issue you a visa for 2 years, and I want you to come back, and I want to see how the business is doing after 2 years, and then I'll consider issuing you a visa for 5 years. So that does happen. So it's always important to check the validity period of your visa. Perfect. So we talked before about the investment amount. The requirement is that, again, you must invest a substantial amount. There is no dollar amount that's defined in the law or the regulations. This is both good and bad. It's bad because you're gonna wonder, right? You're gonna always wonder, have I invested enough money into this business? And because the government hasn't said, well, once you invest X dollars, you've met the requirement, there's not going to be that level of certainty. However, on the other side, the benefit of this vagueness is that you can apply even if you have a low investment amount. And we actually handle many of these cases where there's a low investment amount. The things to keep in mind if you have a relatively low investment amount, and what I mean by a low investment amount is generally speaking under $100,000, is first of all, make sure you've invested all of the funds that are needed for the business to be operational. The second thing is, if you've done that and you are still, say, at $20,000, so if you're starting a law firm or you're starting a consulting firm, that doesn't require a lot of money. You can get space at a WeWork, you can buy a laptop computer, a few resources, some subscriptions online, get a website. That might cost you $20,000. $20,000 is a very, very low investment amount, probably going to be denied. So what do you do at that point? You've spent enough to make the business operational. What do you do? The first thing is to look at whether there are ways to spend more in a way that benefits the business. So for example, Are there ways to pay for your office lease in advance? Could you pay for 6 months in advance? Could you pay for a year in advance? Could you increase your marketing efforts? Could you pay for more Facebook ads? Is it possible to hire an employee or even an independent contractor at this point? For example, someone who can work on your marketing. Maybe you can hire an independent contractor who works on your website. That will meet two requirements. That will increase your investment amount because you're paying this person to provide marketing services. But it also shows that you already have someone that you're paying. So if you've already created a job opportunity for someone, which, as I said before, is a huge benefit in these applications. If you reach a point where you've really spent everything and there's just nothing else you can possibly spend, or you are just strapped for funds, then there's not much you can do. You can try to focus on bringing someone on if it's possible to think about even a lower paid person, maybe to help manage the office part-time or as an independent contractor, something like that. But you do want to look at other aspects of the application that you can strengthen. So for example, even if you can't spend more money, you don't have more funds available, reach out to the local Chamber of Commerce where your business will be and see if they will write a letter talking about the importance of your business for the community, that it will create jobs, that it will serve a need in the community. Consider getting a letter from a certified public accountant where they are saying that you have invested enough to make this business operational. So depending on the type of business. So as an example, I had a client who started a tattoo parlor. And a tattoo parlor didn't require a lot of money, so we got a letter from a certified public accountant who's helped people start tattoo parlors in the past. And they've said, look, I've had many clients start tattoo parlors, and $30,000, $40,000 is sufficient to start this type of business. So a letter from a CPA can be helpful. A letter from the Chamber of Commerce can be helpful. Letters from prospective clients can also be helpful. So where they say, you know, I have a need for the services or the products that this business is going to provide. So once the visa is approved, I do look forward to doing business with them. Those letters also carry weight. But you want to think about the application holistically. So even if I don't have more money I can spend on the business, what are other ways that I can strengthen the business? That really is the right way to think about this. I'm not going to talk much about actually, let me back up. So you see here the second bullet depends on the type of business. This is what I was saying in terms of enough to make the business operational. So obviously a consulting firm, a law firm is going to cost less than, say, a company that's manufacturing something. So you'll actually have to invest in the machinery to manufacture that thing. Where you apply also does matter. So there are certain consulates that see a lot of E-2 visa applications from large companies. They usually want to see a larger investment amount than, say, consulates that deal mostly with startups. And one thing we help our clients do is navigate that and figure out what consulate would be ideal. Finally, overall strength of your case. This is what I was referring to in terms of looking at the application holistically. Can you get letters from a CPA, from a Chamber of Commerce, from prospective clients? That will strengthen the case. The proportionality test is not too relevant for our purposes because it comes into play when you're investing a very large amount into the business, say $1 million, $2 million, $10 million. And basically what it says is if you're investing $10 million into the business, you don't have to invest 100% of that. We might accept 80% of that. So if you invest $8 million out of $10 million, that might be fine. For our purposes, if you're thinking about investing $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, hit 100%. Invest 100% of that amount. Buying a business, we talked about this before, but that buying a business is a great option, as is starting a franchise. I didn't mention that before, but that is the third option. Startup, buying a business, or starting a franchise. If you're buying a business, what is a substantial amount? It is typically the fair market value of the business. So as long as the business you're buying is being advertised to the public and you are paying the publicly available advertised price, that is usually fine. You're usually investing the fair market value. Where you need to be careful here is if you're buying a business from a friend or a family member. And if they are giving you a nice discount on that business, that is a red flag. And there's a good chance that the consulate will decide you haven't invested a substantial amount because you paid under the fair market value. So if you're buying from a friend or a family member, get a letter from an accountant or a firm that does valuations that says that you actually are paying the fair market value of the business. As I mentioned, franchises are a great option for E-2 visas. Franchises will have certain fees that you need to pay, as well as an outline of what you actually need to pay for the business, whether it's marketing, software, etc. So you do want to make sure that you've spent all of the funds that the franchise requires, because you will, in your application, you'll have to include the franchise disclosure document and the agreements that list out what you need to pay. And so the consulate will want to see that you've paid all the things that the franchise requires. Finally, there are good and bad E-2 visa expenses. So as long as you are including expenses that are needed for the business to become operational, they are by and large going to be strong, good expenses. So I'm talking inventory, equipment, an office lease, employee payments. Those are very good expenses. Things like travel, hotels, are not clearly needed for the business, and we would recommend not including those. Educational expenses, not a good expense unless it is training that's specifically required for the business, but like a law degree, a college degree. These are not going to be good expenditures. A vehicle could be a good expenditure if it is clear that a vehicle is needed for the business. So if you're starting a law firm, don't include a vehicle. You don't need a vehicle for a law firm, typically speaking. If you're starting a pool maintenance business or a construction company, a vehicle could be a great expense because there's a good argument to be made that you actually need that vehicle for the business. Do you need to hire U.S. employees? The answer is yes, but you don't need to hire employees before you apply for the visa. So if you are applying with a startup, for example, and you don't have any employees, you can be approved based on your business plan. A business plan is going to show all of the financial assumptions, all of the financial projections, what you're going to sell, the job duties of everyone at the business, and it's going to show personnel projections for the next 5 years. If you have a really good business plan, it can be sufficient to be approved if you haven't hired anyone, and we see this all the time. But business plans are not all created equal. You do want to make sure to work with a good business plan preparer. It is a service we provide to our clients, so we're happy to do that for you. But a business plan becomes critical if you don't already have the sufficient number of U.S. employees. So again, sufficient number of employees is at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. workers within 5 years of starting operations. If you're buying a business and it's been operational for a few years, do make sure it's already employing 3 workers. Let's see here. What else? W-2 employees versus 1099 workers. There is a spectrum. So having W-2 employees, full-time W-2 employees, that is the strongest way to satisfy this employment requirement. The weakest way to satisfy it is 1099 independent contractors. However, if you're in an industry that regularly uses independent contractors, so say construction, for example, 1099 contractors can be okay, that you can get an approval if you have 1099 contractors. You do usually want to show, though, that you have certainly more than 3. So 3 full-time equivalent U.S. employees would generally meet the requirement. If you're working with contractors, you want to have, I'd say, aim for 8, 9, 10 independent contractors. And also it's wonderful to show that you are generating work for them over time, that there's not high turnover, but you've had the same contractors for a number of years and they receive good compensation as contractors. So how do you prove that you will meet the employment requirement? I mentioned a business plan. That's going to be key for a startup. For existing businesses, you're going to want to include pay stubs, payroll records, W-2 tax forms showing that you are declaring to the IRS payments to employees. Really any documentation that's generated from employment. So let's talk a little more about the business plan because it really is a key piece if you're applying with a startup and you don't already have employees. So what should be in the business plan? The most important part of a business plan is the executive summary. That's going to be the first page or two of the business plan. And that part is important because, in all honesty, consular officers don't usually spend a lot of time with your application. So if they're going to look at a business plan, our business plans are usually 30 pages or more. They're very detailed. So that executive summary on the first 1 or 2 pages is probably going to be the only thing the officer looks at if they look at the business plan at all. So in that executive summary, you want it to be very clear, the key parts, what the company is going to sell, where it's going to be based, what your role is going to be as an E2 investor, how many employees you're going to have in 5 years, what your revenue is going to be in 5 years. So those are really going to be the key things for the executive summary. And then the rest of the business plan is going to detail your market analysis, who your competitors are, your marketing plan, what you're going to sell, how you're going to get clients, the personnel plan, who you are going to hire over the next 5 years, in each of the next 5 years, what roles, what positions, how much you're going to pay, what those job duties are going to be. And finally, a comprehensive financial plan. So 5 years of projections, profit and loss statements, balance sheets, cash flow analyses, things like that. And again, we do provide this service to our clients. You don't have to work with an immigration lawyer for the business plan. There are third parties that create good business plans. I would say that the important thing, though, to keep in mind is know your audience, and it's important that the person preparing the business plan knows the audience. The audience is not, a venture capitalist. The audience is a consular officer. So you want to make sure that you're framing the business plan to really hit the points that a government immigration bureaucrat wants to see. Finally, sorry, not finally, but next slide, a few E2 visa considerations. There are 2 main pathways to apply for E2 status. One is USCIS, and the other is a consulate. If you want a visa allows you to enter and exit the U.S. multiple times, generally speaking. You have to go to a consulate. Only consulates can issue visas. USCIS is an option if you're already inside the U.S., and what they can give you is E2 status. But the important thing to know about E2 status issued by USCIS is that it's abandoned the moment you leave the U.S. So most of our clients, our recommendation would usually be to apply through a consulate for an E2 visa. However, there are some circumstances where applying through USCIS makes sense. First of all, if they're already in the U.S. And they would be in another status. Let's say you're a student, you're studying accounting, and you want to start an accounting firm on an E2 visa on E2 status in the U.S. Then applying for a change of status through USCIS could make sense because you're already here, and you can get an expedited decision from USCIS. USCIS has something called premium processing, which will give you a decision within 15 business days. It does cost about $3,000 to get that expedited decision, but it is going to be the fastest way for you to get E2 status. To my knowledge, there is no consulate that will give you a decision in 2 weeks. Consulates are generally taking about 3 months from the date of application to the date of the interview, 3 to 6 months, I'd say. But that depends on location, by and large. But again, the benefit of a consulate is you actually get a visa in your passport, and with that, you can enter and exit as many times as you want. What you can also do if you're in the U.S. is apply for both change of status through USCIS and submit the application to the consulate. This is good for people who want to get the business running as quickly as possible, but also to get in line for a visa. So let's go back to our example of the student studying accounting. They might say, I'm from Canada, studied accounting, I want to start my accounting firm as quickly as possible. We would say, okay, well, we'll apply for a change of status through USCIS. You'll get a decision in about 2 to 3 weeks. At the same time, we'll file the application at the consulate. Consulate's not going to get to you in 3 months or so. But in the meantime, once you're approved by USCIS, you can start running the firm, the accounting firm. And then when the Toronto consulate calls you and you leave the US, go to your interview, get your visa, and then you have a 5-year visa and you can enter and exit as often as you want. And each time you enter, you get 2 years of E-2 status. Next, the source and trail of funds. So, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, you do have to show exactly where your funds came from. USCIS has a very high standard for this. They are going to look at every single document showing every step your funds took, from the source to you moving the funds into your company and actually spending the funds. Consulates tend not to be as strict about the source of funds. You do have to show, of course, that they're from a lawful source, but whereas USCIS would need all of the bank statements, all of the transfer receipts, consulates will usually accept streamlined documentation, and they usually have page limits, so you can't actually give them everything related. So that's important to keep in mind. Loans are a permissible source of funds, so you can get a loan, but it needs to be secured by your personal assets. You cannot use funds that are secured by the E-2 company's assets. That's not going to count as an allowed source of funds. You can also include gifts, but again, with gifts, you do need to still show where the person who gave you the gift got the funds. Considerations for small investment amounts. I already talked about this, but try to bolster your application in other ways, such as letters of intent from prospective clients and a letter from the CPA. We already talked about before, you can have an E-2 investor visa for 2 investors based on the same company. They each need to have 50% of the company under their ownership. Substantive changes to the business after filing. This comes up every once in a while where someone will apply for an E-2 visa to run a restaurant, and then the restaurant will not do so well, and so they start, goodness, I don't know what, a wedding planning company. That can be a real problem because, again, your work authorization is limited to what you say you're going to do in the E-2 application. So what you need to do is, first of all, talk with an attorney before you start doing something different from what you told the government you would do. You can apply for an amendment. You can apply for approval from USCIS or the consulate, but it's important to do that before you actually violate your work authorization because that can cause some big problems. Also, if you think you're going to do something outside the scope of your E-2 company, before you've applied, expand that scope. So if you think, I might start a restaurant, I'll start a restaurant, but I might also start, some other type of company, then include that in the scope. This company is going to be a restaurant, and we're going to do this other thing too, and include that in the scope of the business so that if you end up pursuing that, it's fine, and if you don't, it's okay. You've still got your restaurant. Higher risk cases. So real estate, equity trading, and family business purchases. We already talked about this to some degree. Real estate and equity trading are risky because the government doesn't always believe that you're going to employ workers. If you're doing equity trading, buying stocks, hoping that they appreciate in value, sell the stocks, it's not clear that you actually need anyone else to help you do that. So you want to show in your application why you're going to need employees. So you're going to be servicing, dozens of clients, and you need someone to do marketing, and you need someone to do due diligence, whatever it is. Same with real estate investing. Show why you actually need employees to do the work. Family business purchases, I already explained, which is if you're getting a discount from a family member or a friend on the business you're buying, that is a red flag. So pay the fair market value for the business you're buying. Common reasons for denials: low investment amount, the nature of the business, real estate, equity, we already talked about that. Filing location, some consulates are stricter than others, and also USCIS with the source of funds. If you have a weak source of funds, such as crypto, maybe go to a consulate instead of USCIS. If you have a business in your home country that's very similar to the E-2 business, but you've never had employees, that could be a red flag. So if you say, I'm starting a consulting company in the US, I'm qualified to do this because I've been doing the same thing in Canada for 10 years, and the officer says, okay, great. How many employees do you have in Canada? And you say, well, it's just me. Well, then the next question is going to be, well, then why should I believe you're going to hire workers in the US? And you're going to need to explain that. You will be starting from a defensive position. So if it's possible to bolster your foreign company before you apply and be able to say, look, in our most recent year, we had 3 employees in Canada. that can benefit your application. Issues with the officers. Some officers are not well trained. Some officers are against issuing visas. Some officers are just in a bad mood. So there's nothing you can really do about that other than show up as prepared as you can be. If you are denied, you can apply again, generally speaking, and usually you will be assigned a different officer, which is a good thing. And finally, sometimes people do apply without meeting the requirements. So people will sometimes come to us and say, I was denied, we now want to work with you, and we'll look at the initial application and they just don't qualify. They might not own 50% of the business, or they might not have spent any of the funds. The funds might be sitting in a business bank account. So you do need to make sure you meet the requirements. What does it take to renew a visa? Most important is to hire U.S. workers. Again, at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. workers within 5 years. You want to include W-2 forms, payroll records, proof that you're paying these employees. If your company's not doing well at the time to renew, hire workers if you can before you apply to renew. And make sure that you still meet the E-2 requirements. Maintain 50% ownership at least, and don't change the business in a substantial way without first getting approval from the government. Finally, some trends and developments. E-2 visas still have high approval rates. The government's published rates are 80 to 90%, which are high. Our firms are in the high 90s. That's not a guarantee of future performance, but we do have a very high approval rate. The government does want to see that at least half of your investment is made in the U.S. So if you have $100,000 to spend on the business and your business is importing goods from China to sell in the U.S., try not to spend over $50,000 on products in China. Actually spend half of it in the U.S. Marketing, getting a commercial space, getting equipment, things like that. Excuse me. Hiring of U.S. citizens. Permanent residents are fine. People with work authorization are fine. But the government may want to see hiring of U.S. citizens, and you should show a plan to hire U.S. workers. That is critical. Try to get employees rather than contractors. Again, employees are stronger than contractors when it comes to the application. Administrative processing. This is something that has happened with more frequency in recent years. It's basically an additional screening of the application. It's a black box, meaning you don't always know why the application's in administrative processing, and it seems that oftentimes it is random. I have had children, a 10-year-old, put in administrative processing, which means the application submitted to the consulate, his father applied for the E-2 visa and applied for his son to join him, and the son, who was 10, the application was put in administrative processing, which means the consulate says, okay, we're going to keep your passport, but we need to do some additional security review, and it took a couple weeks, and then he got his passport and visa back. But administrative processing can take typically between a week or 2 months. And again, it's hard, if not impossible, to find out why the application is being reviewed, and it does seem random. So just have this in mind that it is a possibility. Fortunately, it is rare. Even though it does sometimes happen, it is still rare. So not something to worry about, but something to be aware of. Consulates are really getting back to pre-COVID times. So again, the average time at a consulate between applying and actually getting your visa is 3 to 6 months for most consulates, which is pretty good. Most consulates don't have a way to expedite applications unless you're talking health or catastrophic business risk if there is a delay. So you do need to be prepared to prove that this business is going to fail if the consulate doesn't give you an interview soon. And even then, they might not expedite your interview. With that, I know we've gotten a few questions, so I am going to switch the questions. Feel free to send in any other questions you have. Can my brother be a co-investor if I am the primary investor and he contributes $50K? Also, can he use a personal loan in his name to cover the remaining investment balance? So I am going to assume that the brother is not applying for an E-2 visa and that the person asking this question is the one applying for an E-2 visa. So when that's the case, really focus on yourself as the E-2 investor. So you as an individual need to contribute a substantial amount into the business. So if you have a 50-50 owner, as long as the total amount that's invested into the business is sufficient to show that the business is operational, to make the business operational, and you've invested enough to show that you are committed to the business, that should meet the requirement. So let's say the total investment amount is $100,000 as this person asked. And it's 50,000 each investor. That is probably going to be fine as long as you can show that 100,000 was sufficient for the business to be operational, and they're your personal funds that you are investing into the business. Can the brother use a personal loan in his name? Doesn't matter. If he's not applying for the visa, the source of his funds, if you're applying at a consulate, generally don't matter. Now, the exception to that is if you're applying to USCIS. USCIS may well want to see the source of his funds, and a personal loan in his name is, generally speaking, fine because it's not secured by the business assets. To prove the source of funds, can I sell assets in my home country to a buyer located in the U.S. and have them wire the U.S. dollars directly to my U.S. account to bypass local transfer restrictions? So you always want to comply with the law. So if your home country has a requirement to show the transfers, if you're going to bypass that, it just needs to be legal. So if it is legal to use an alternative route, that is okay. This sometimes happens, for example, in China for EB-5 applications where there are limits on the amount you can transfer out of the country. And there are lawful ways to transfer funds out of the country. You just need to make sure you're following the law. So in general, it is fine to sell assets in your home country to a buyer in the U.S. if that's a legitimate sale. And if they wire the US dollars directly to your U.S. account, as long as that's lawful and complying with regulations, that is an okay source of funds. You just need to be ready to show the government documentation showing that that is the source of funds and the path you followed. If a petition's denied and we need to refile with adjustments, does the firm charge a full legal fee again? That depends. Please reach out to us and we're happy to share with you our filing fees. Feel free to schedule a consultation as well if you want to talk about the specifics. For a B1 visa holder with a family, is it safer to file a change of status within the U.S. and then bring the family rather than applying at an embassy together? Not necessarily. A B1 visa holder, no, there are risks. There are risks with both paths. Neither path is guaranteed, whether that's USCIS or a consulate. As long as you complied with your B1 status and did not work without authorization, you can apply through either. You just want to make sure to comply with your I-94, leave before your B1 status expires, or apply to change your status before your I-94 expires. But either option is generally fine. There are certain circumstances. So if there's a reason why you're concerned about leaving the U.S. and coming back in, then you may want to stay. But based on what you shared in the question, in general, there is not usually a reason to apply for a change of status over applying at the consulate, unless there is a reason to think that you might face issues at the border or at the consulate. So if you want to talk about that further, do schedule a consultation. One example is if you have a criminal record. So you do want to be strategic about that, or if you've faced issues at the border in the past. Regarding franchise selection, does your firm evaluate a specific project, or can we review multiple options? Yes, we can do that as part of our services. People do share with us profit and loss statements, tax returns, and we can look at that if you're looking at several options. You can also work with a franchise broker. So we have contacts with franchise brokers who look at franchise options through an E-2 visa compliance lens. So schedule a consultation. We'd be happy to talk with you about that. Is the process similar for E-2 treaty investor employees? That's a great question. So if you have to take a step back, if you have an E-2 company, meaning the company is owned at least 50% by nationals of an E-2 treaty country, then that company can hire employees from the E-2 treaty country as managers, executives, or specialized employees. The process is not the same for E-2 treaty employees, and the reason is employees need to show that they qualify as managers, executives, or with specialized knowledge. So they don't have to show investment, they don't have to show employment, source of funds, they don't have to show that. They do need to show they qualify for the employee role. So it is different. But the process in terms of applying through USCIS or the consulate is largely the same. You would either apply for a change of status through USCIS or an E-2 employee visa at a consulate. And we're happy to talk about that with you more over a consultation. I was told I had to contribute over $100,000 to open a business. I've helped my son. He was going to be a partner. Start a business with inheritance funds. I'm in the U.S. on another visa. My son's a citizen. The store is about to open and will hire 4 to 6 U.S. workers. Can I apply for my E-2 visa after the store is open? So there's a lot there. I think in essence what you are asking is you have a U.S. citizen who is running the company right now, and you are at least 50% owner of that company. Can you apply for the visa to come to the U.S. after the U.S. citizens got the business operating, and then once you're in the U.S., you will run the business? That is, generally speaking, fine to do, and is actually oftentimes a smart way to approach this, because the U.S. citizen obviously can work, so there's not a work authorization issue. And you're able to show in your application that this is a viable business. It's already working. It's already got clients. It's already employing people. So you can have a very strong E-2 application there. The thing you want to be careful of is not to enter the U.S. and run the company before you have your E-2 visa, because then you're violating your work authorization or restrictions on it. So do be careful with that. Are specialist companies such as commercial driving contractors strong options? No, there is no industry that's stronger or weaker. The important thing is being able to show the government that the business is likely to employ U.S. workers. If you are investing a substantial amount in the business and you show the government it will employ U.S. workers, it does not really matter the industry as long as it's legal. So don't start a cannabis or a marijuana company since it's illegal under federal law. So as long as you're not doing that, then the industry does not really matter. So I hope this webinar was helpful. Please do reach out for a consultation if you have any questions. Keep an eye out for our future webinars and our email. Also, we do record our webinars. They are posted to our YouTube channel, the full-length webinars, as well as shorter videos. So do check out our YouTube channel when you have a chance. A link to that will be in our email after this presentation. Thank you so much. Stay well and have a great day.